Good afternoon, everyone. This is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020. Thank you all for joining us today for our conference call on protests in India, understanding identity, minority rights, and citizenship. So immediately prior to the coronavirus overtaking all of the news, one of the biggest stories was actually some of the riots that were passing through Delhi. And in our efforts to highlight some of what else is happening in the world, we decided to return to that story with the wonderful Professor Sital Kalantry, who has spoken to Network 2020 in the past, and two of her law students who recently returned from a field mission in Assam, India. So Professor Kalantry writes in the fields of comparative feminist legal theory, international human rights, and empirical studies of courts. Her scholarship seeks to identify how legal norms aimed at promoting human rights sometimes undermine gender and racial equality when they migrate across national borders. She's informed by a decade of human rights practice in international and domestic courts and uses interdisciplinary methods to understand what mechanisms best promote state compliance with international human rights. She also studies why judicial institutions, particularly in India, fail to effectively provide justice using empirical methodologies. And both Smridhi Kaur is a Cornell Law School student, and she will be graduating in 2020 with a JD ILA degree with a specialization in international legal affairs. She is currently a part of the International Human Rights Policy Advocacy Clinic at Cornell Law, and she was one of the 3 clinic members that conducted fieldwork in Assam, India in February of 2020, along with her classmate Prachee Sawant, who is a second-year law student at Cornell Law School, who is also a part of the International Human Rights Policy Advocacy Clinic. The fieldwork that they did consisted of attending a 2-day-long conference on the subject of statelessness in India, interviews of residents of Assam whose Indian citizenship became legally suspect sometime in the last 10 years, and interviews of lawyers and civil society experts on the question of citizenship in Assam. So we are really lucky to have all 3 of them on the call today. So what I'll do to start out, just so everyone listening knows the direction of the call, is Professor Kalantry will give an overview of the citizenship and migration law in India and put that in context. And then we'll hear from some of the students who are part of the field mission as to what they learned during their time on the ground. So with that, I will prior to turning over to Professor Kalantry, I just want to remind everyone that if you would like to ask a question at any time, please do email Brian at bthang@network2020.org. That's bthang@network2020.org, and he'll send the question so that we can ask it. It's the easiest way that we can do that without having a free-for-all on the call. So with that, Professor Kalantry, thank you so much for being with us. I'd love to just turn it over to you to give us some background on the citizenship and migration law.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for inviting me. It was a pleasure to speak with you all. The last time I spoke was about a decade ago, which was also related to India. It was in person then, but now we're in a virtual world, so this is still a delight to be here. So although I'm going to talk about protests, today in India, there are none. The Prime Minister Modi, with just 4 hours notice, instituted a 3-week lockdown of the entire country last week. As a result, a peaceful sit-in in New Delhi, consisting mostly of women, which has been going on continuously since mid-December, was forcefully disbanded. The women were protesting a law that gave the pathway to citizenship to people who suffered religious persecution in neighboring states. But there was no such pathway given to Muslim people, as well as other religious groups. The forceful reactions to this law and the counter reactions led to a number of deaths, over 50 deaths, largely Muslim people, in violence that erupted between both many sides of the issue in February. So in today's talk, I will explain why these nationwide protests occurred and the larger issues at stake in regard to citizenship, minority rights, and identity in India. In doing so, I'd like to make 3 points. First, that the protests and the reaction to this law, known as the Citizenship Amendment Act, which I'll call the CAA, can only be understood in the broader context of Modi's administration and its policies. Second, the protests only scratch the surface of the larger problem in India, in Indian policy of the disparate treatment of refugees. And third, even before the passage of this new law, another less globally known battle for defining who is Indian has been unfolding in the Indian state of Assam in northeast India, which, as Courtney mentioned, our 2 students, Prachee and Smridhi, had done a field mission to just right in mid-February before everything closed down. So by way of background, let me explain what is the CAA and how did it change the rules governing citizenship. So the CAA allows people who had already been living in India a pathway and a fast-track pathway to citizenship if they suffered religious persecution. Now, at an initial glance, that seems like a positive thing. India is welcoming people who are persecuted, and that's exactly how the BJP portrayed it. But the problem is that the only people from certain religious groups, namely Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsis, and Christians, were given a pathway to citizenship, and Muslims were notably excluded. And it's important to note that the largest minority religious group in India is Muslim, with over 15% of the population. Furthermore, refugees only from 3 neighboring countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, were allowed this pathway to citizenship, notably not people from Myanmar or Sri Lanka. So going to the first point, right? What is this? Why was this strong reaction? We saw it in the global media, talking about the violence, talking about the protests. It's because it's the larger context of the Bharatiya Janata Party. So the BJP first came to power in 2014, and Modi was re-elected prime minister last year. His party again came to power by a wide margin in one of the world's largest elections. And ceasing on this mandate they received in their re-election, the government has become increasingly authoritarian and less shy about promoting a Hindu nationalist agenda. The recent abrogation of the semi-independent status of Kashmir is an example of these authoritarian tactics. As many of you know, Kashmir is a state that borders Pakistan, and it's been disputed. But since India's independence in 1947, it had semi-autonomous status within India. But after decades of violence and terrorism, through clever lawyering, the BJP just revoked this semi-independent status that was guaranteed by the Constitution. And to quell protests, which they knew would be massive, the central government blocked internet, blocked phone services, imposed a curfew, and placed numerous leaders in house arrest. And even beyond this, civil liberties had come under threat increasingly in India. People are penalized for criticizing the government. For example, public universities were threatened with being defunded. Civil rights activists have been jailed on trumped-up charges, and some journalists killed. So it is within this context that the protests against the CAA emerged. I think the CAA is really a proxy for the dissatisfaction many people felt in the country with an increasingly authoritarian government that is impinging on civil liberties and minority rights. Protesters all over India gathered around and read the preamble of the Constitution. And what this did was, while everyone understood that the motive for reading the preamble was to suggest that the BJP's government's policies were in breach of Indian constitutional values, they didn't directly criticize the government, which was a very kind of brilliant strategy. Whereas in other parts, there was more direct critique of the CIA. But there became safety in numbers. The BJP could not easily quell the protests with threats. And instead, as I mentioned earlier, anti-CAA people came violently to try to stop protests, this was seen as it was Muslim people protesting, but it wasn't really. It was more than just that. But then this led to all these deaths. So the second point I wanted to make is that the protests really only scratch the surface of the real problem of the disparate treatment of refugees by India. 75% of the countries in the world are party to what is known as the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. But India has continuously refused to become a party to it. Even the United States is a party to the 1968 protocol to the convention, and our administration begrudgingly follows its rules. The convention requires a state to accept people from any country who suffered persecution on grounds of religion, political opinion, nationality, racial identity, or are from a particular social group. If India were a party to that convention, it would never have been able to give preferential treatment to certain types of refugees over others. But historically, India has always treated refugees disparately. For example, India has a long history of accepting Tibetan refugees, with the Dalai Lama making his residence in India, but has refused to accept the influx of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. Indeed, the CAA is not that remarkable at all, and is very consistent with this decades-long policy of treating refugees differently. In 2015, the Home Minister had passed an order that essentially mirrors this new law. They amended their passport control rules to allow, without valid documentation into India, only the same groups that are outlined in the CAA, and only from the same 3 countries. But there was no nationwide protest against this order. This may be because an order of the executive is not as widely publicized as an act of parliament that eventually codified this policy. However, it also could be, as I mentioned, it's the lack of the initial response in the early on in the BJP regime is because the CAA now serves more as a proxy for broader dissatisfaction of the government rather than anything else. So finally, the third point I wanted to turn to, and this will lead into the discussion of Assam, is that I want to draw your attention to the northeastern part of India. Moving away, Kashmir is in the west, and Assam borders Bangladesh. In 1971, we have to go back to history a little bit to understand the refugee crisis at stake there. When current Bangladesh became independent of Pakistan, it used to be East Pakistan, a huge number of people migrated and were welcomed from that territory into bordering Indian states. And one of those states is Assam, which saw a huge number of such migration. And the interesting thing about Assam, you should note, is that previously it was part of Myanmar, and it was only in the 1930s that the British colonial Raj took it over as part of the larger territory of India. So ethnically, the people in Assam are different from the people migrating from the former East Pakistan, and this led to tension within the country, and the central government negotiated a pact with the protesters in Assam, which basically said that they would be willing to legalize many of the undocumented migrants who came around 1971, but would deny a pathway to citizenship to any migrants who came after that. Now, no one will dispute that a state has the right under international law and otherwise to determine the requirements for being a citizen, and corollary, it also can deport people who are not citizens or who otherwise have not entered legally into the country in question. And some say there should be open borders. That's sort of a different question I'll leave to the side now. So initially, in India, a person could acquire citizenship merely by birth, which is how it works in the United States. It's codified in our Constitution. But after 1987, birth was not enough to qualify for citizenship. The person must have been born in India, and his or her parents must not have been undocumented citizens. There's also a way, or undocumented migrants. There's also a way to gain citizenship through residency, but that can only be done if people entered India legally in the first place. So in a country like India, the sheer process of making a determination of who is a citizen is challenging. In trying to distinguish a citizen from a non-citizenship, the government created a document called the Register of Citizens. But this process was itself flawed. People with Muslim names were more likely to be left off, for example. And who does this impact? Around 2 million people living in Assam are not on the register. And so if you're not on the register, you have to appear before these quasi-judicial tribunals called foreigners' tribunals. And before these tribunals, the individual has the burden of proving citizenship. So in the US, someone might prove citizenship using their birth certificate or also show residence by bank statements, utility bills, driver's license. But in India, only 55% of births are recorded. Everyone knows that it does not have a great system of recording births. And poor people don't have electricity or utility bills and may not even have homes within which to store paperwork. Once it's determined by this tribunal that a person is not Indian, well, they're then likely not a citizen of any place because they left Bangladesh before it was Bangladesh, the territory of Bangladesh. And at this point, Bangladesh has said they're not accepting any deportees. And so they've become this underclass of citizens that are continually threatened to be detained, sent to detention centers, come out of detention centers, can't own property, can't vote. And, what's more scary, right, is that the Home Minister had said that he would like to bring this entire process for distinguishing who is citizen and not citizen from Assam to the entire rest of India. Of course, he backed away a little bit from that once the protests for the Citizenship Amendment Act emerged, but there is still a threat that might happen. So with that, let me turn it to Prachee, who will then turn it to Smridhi to talk about each of them will talk about a person that they met and interviewed and the challenges they faced in determining their citizenship. So Prachee, do you want to take it over?
Yeah, sure. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Kalantry. That was a brilliant overview of the issues we're currently facing in India. To start off,
I'll be... the pass-fail grade, so I did not,
Yes.
I didn't bribe her for the saying that, because all of our grades now have gone pass-fail, but he's not online.
And I will start off with a case study that we found in the Char regions of Assam. So to give you a background on what the Char regions are, the Char regions are located in the Brahmaputra riverbank. The Char people do not have a fixed residence. The houses in Char regions are flooded on a regular basis. So most of these people living in these areas move their residence every year to whatever part of the river surfaces. In these Char regions, the first person we interviewed was a woman called Rahima. This woman has been, again, migrating every year. In winter, she moves to whatever part of the river, whatever part of the land comes up above the water. When we initially arrived at her house, she was too scared to talk to us. Later during the interview, she told us that she runs away every time someone wearing jeans comes to her house. It is because she fears that these people wearing jeans are people from the government and they will drag her away from her family. This shows us the kind of constant fear these people are living in and the kind of trauma they have suffered. During the interview, Rahima told us that she had been left off the National Register of Citizenship because she couldn't establish a link to her father, who is an Indian citizen. Now, the reason why she couldn't establish this link was because her name is not on any of the property papers that belong to her father. The reason why her name is not on any of the property papers of her family is because most families in these regions believe that property should be handed off only to the sons of the family, and that daughters should have no right to such property. So once she was left off the list because of this sort of social construct, she actually ran away from home. She was living on the streets for 3 months in constant fear that she would be deported or detained. Her neighbors would occasionally bring her food. In the first few days, her children cried and refused to eat due to anxiety from separation. In fact, one of them, she feared, was going to pass away. This is how the NRC has had a discriminatory effect, especially on women, and as a natural consequence has caused trauma for the rest of the family. Once she returned home after 3 months of being in hiding on the run, she made multiple attempts to get back on the list. She approached various officers, like lawyers, police officers, government officials, to get her name back on the list. But in these regions, most Char people are so poor, most of them are illiterate. They don't know what official documents look like. So on multiple occasions, she paid these officers to get her name on the list. But once she paid them, she never heard back from them. So there's been a lot of swindling that's going on in these areas. After all of this happened, last year, around rainy season, their house got flooded for a few days. During this period of time, they actually had to stand up on their tin roofs for the duration of those 3 or 4 days that their houses were flooded. When they were standing on their roofs, they barely had any, bare necessities. They did not have food. They did not have other necessary items that they needed, but they stood on their roofs holding their documents in their hands. This is the kind of impact the NRC has had on the Char people. The main takeaway that we got from this interview was that these people living in the Char region barely have a residence. They don't have any access to amenities or any resources. They are destitute. The one thing that they had to their name, their citizenship, a right to have rights, is also now being taken away by their government. So this is the story of someone from the Char region. I would like to hand over this call to Smridhi, who will talk about another person in Bongaigaon, Assam.
Thank you so much, Prachee. That was fantastic. I want to focus on the story of a farmer who used to cultivate land and had just enough land to cultivate and sustain his family. We met him at his house in Bongaigaon, which is situated in Lower Assam, and is the region from where disproportionate numbers of cases come before the Foreigners Tribunal. He lives in Bongaigaon with his wife, sons, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren. His father and grandfather appeared in the voter rolls in 1951. His mother and his father's names appeared in the voter rolls of 1966. His own name appears in the voter rolls of 1985 and 2008. All of this indicates that at least 3 generations of his family have resided in India and have been given in the past the rights accorded to citizens, specifically the right to vote. However, in 2011, the state sent him a notice which said effectively that they were not so sure that he was a citizen, and they changed their status, therefore, to that of a doubtful voter. He challenged this. He hired a lawyer with the meager income and the meager resources he had. He spent about 70,000 rupees over the course of 3 years. At the end of it, he anyway lost his case. He was detained in 2015 and was in detention for 4 years of his life. When we interviewed him, he repeatedly emphasized that he was not detained in a civil facility. He was detained in the Golpara jail, along with murderers and criminal under trials.
All he had was half a square feet of space to himself. The food made him routinely sick. They had no medical facilities available to give to the detainees. He pointed out to us that many people around him died in detention from the poor jail conditions. His family was not allowed to meet him too often or for too long, and when they met him, they had no privacy. In fact, the first time he was taken away, he was put in detention, his family wasn't even informed where they were taking him or why they were taking him away. His sons looked for him for 3 days before they received a phone call from another inmate at the Golpara jail, who informed them that their father, SS, was with him as an inmate at the Golpara jail. Imagine having only half a square feet of space to yourself and the physical and mental toll it takes. But he wasn't the only one suffering. His family was too. The impact of this process has been extended both to the person being affected and to their family in ways that are underappreciated at most. While he was in detention 6 months after he was taken away, SS's wife suffered from a stroke that caused the left side of her body to be completely paralyzed. Earlier, he was in charge of running the household than his wife was. After one was taken away by the state and the other fell sick, they did not have the resources to consult doctors with the best ability to treat her. The whole responsibility to run the household then fell on the daughter-in-law, who wanted to study, who wanted to work, but she had to give up everything to run the household, to take care of her ailing mother-in-law. In 2019, one day, suddenly, SS was released from jail. Turns out that the Supreme Court of India had issued an order for the release of the so-called foreigners who had been in detention for more than 3 years. He was still asked to report to the local police station every week. The irony is that he is right now a citizen under one process and a foreigner under another, and he still has to report to that police station every week. What I mean by this is the NRC process in 2019 was a completely different and parallel process than the one under which SS was first informed that he was a foreigner. This process was to be carried out anew. It was supposed to be a renewal of the National Register of Citizens and was separate and independent of the foreigners' tribunal process that had been going on before. On that list in 2019, not only did SS find his family's names, he also found his own. So the NRC said he was a citizen, but he had already spent 4 years in jail, not in detention, as he liked to point out, under a parallel process that said he was a foreigner. It seems like the state cannot make up his mind, but he lost the meager economic resources that he and his family possessed. He used to cultivate. He now survives on the income he receives from running a rice mill. That's it from me.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kalantry. Thank you, Smridhi. Thank you, Prachee, for this fantastic overview and very sobering stories of what it's like on the ground. With that, I'd like to start to open this up to questions. So if you do have a question, please email Brian at bthang@network2020.org. That's bthang@network2020.org. And so, prior to opening it up to the rest of the questions, I would just like to, if you wouldn't mind, just clarifying a little bit, because or Smridhi, I believe it was your account of the man brought up a lot of questions about who is in charge and different parallel processes. And I was wondering, could you elaborate on that a little bit, because it seems like it's quite confusing in terms of why there are these different processes and how they're affecting people and who has control. And Professor Kalantry, you might be able to elaborate on why that is, and whether it's the structure of the Indian legal framework, or if there's something else contributing to that.
Maybe
Sure.
Go ahead.
Sure. So at least since 1951, the central government and the state government of Assam have been trying to determine who is a foreigner in Assam and who is a citizen. They've made multiple attempts. They've also stopped those different processes midway to start anew. So the two processes that I referred to in my case study were the ones that began in 2008 and the one that began in 2017. So in 2008, the Supreme Court, in fact, in 2005, there was a judgment of the Supreme Court of India that said that the process of determining who is a citizen in Assam needs to be carried out in a fast-forward manner, and needed to be done by 2020. Under that process, some people were issued notices saying that they were potentially not citizens and were given the chance to challenge that notification in front of a foreigners tribunal. Under that process, some people challenged their status. They were still declared foreigners, and they spent some time in jail. Now, when the Modi government or the NDA government came to power, they decided to update the National Register of Citizens, which has existed at least since 1951 in Assam, and carry the process out anew in a separate parallel process. So under that, the National Register of Citizens was updated to, again, assess who is a citizen and who is not a citizen. Now, as matters stand today, under the NRC, we would see appeals coming in where individuals who have been left out from the NRC will challenge it again before the foreigners tribunals to say that they should have been included because they're citizens, and here's the evidence proving that. That process of appealing the NRC hasn't begun. So all the appeals and all the cases before the foreigners tribunals that we have seen so far are under the parallel process that began after the 2005 judgment of the Supreme Court of India. And it's called the parallel FT process in scholarly articles out there.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Kalantry, did you want to add to that, or
No, I think that's just that it's just two different people doing two different. The Supreme Court sort of intervened and pushed the process in one direction, and the executive has done anything. It's just completely discoordinated.
Okay, got it. All right. And as a reminder to everyone who's listening, if you'd like to ask a question, please email Brian at bthang@network2020.org. So our first question is, how has Modi defended himself against critics who claim this law constitutes discrimination? And is there any legal basis to Modi's arguments?
Well, I think as the administration has framed it as something very beneficial that they're doing. They're accepting refugees from various countries. They've also, and it is true that, minority religions, like Hindus, for example, are persecuted in Pakistan. There's just a story of them not, apparently, there's issues of them not being fed during this coronavirus crisis. So that's true. And I think that's what he's saying is, well, we want to, bring these people in that have been persecuted. But also the problem is that there are certain minority Muslim religions that are also persecuted in countries like Pakistan. So I think, the way he's defended it is just to ignore all of the other persecution. And you don't want to take the Rohingyas. Why not take the Rohingyas? Those are the people we all know and see have been persecuted. In terms of whether many have argued, there is a case in the Supreme Court right now. Everything is suspended except emergency hearings, like in most courts. But there is a case that says that the Citizenship Amendment Act violates Article 14, which is the right to equality provisions of the Constitution. And, we'll see how that proceeds.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is about what happens with people that are deemed, basically stateless under this new law, and what will happen to them. I know you mentioned detention centers. Is it deportation? And how will this affect regional relations?
So maybe do either Prachee and Smridhi want to jump in on that? I can also elaborate.
Yeah, we can definitely join in on that question. So firstly, there's a process of appeals, like Smridhi mentioned. But from our interviews with quite a few of the lawyers, what we've heard is the FD court is going to be consistent of the same members who declared these people foreigners. So chances are, even when these people appeal, they're going to lose. And so once they're declared foreigners, they will be detained in these detention centers that are being built across India. And these are really cramped spaces, like 7 acres for 4,000 people. And those kind of statistics have been surfacing. Now, again, you cannot keep so many people in detention for very long. So what most scholars are expecting is that after a few years, these people will be released back into the society, but they will form, as Professor Kalantry mentioned, a sort of subclass of citizens, people who have no rights, people who don't have rights to a basic wage, a minimum wage in the country, people who don't have the right to vote, and all of these other facilities and these amenities that are available to the citizen of India. So they will form these new lower rank of people, and they will basically supply cheap labor to the government at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you. Again, if you have a question, please email Brian at bthang@network2020.org. Our next question is a looking ahead question, and I realize that this might be a bit complicated for a country like India, but a lot has been made of technology and e-governance and documentation. And is there any hope that that the advent of new technology might help alleviate this problem once people are properly documented? Because I know you had mentioned that the storage of documents is something that is complicated. But is there any hope for e-governance to make this, to help with the system?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question as to whether India is has more cell phones than landlines, so it's sort of internet's there. There's a lot of computer software engineers. We know it is a technological savvy country. So why can't they get this together and use this data that they maybe have to figure out who's a citizen and who's not? I think it's probably at the lower levels not that easy. I think the way this process was done of creating this register was to go and consult at the local levels, and it might be a little bit less digitized than we would hope. The various rules, like the voter registration rules, etc. But maybe I know Prachee and Smridhi, spent basically 10 days speaking to lawyers and activists and who are deeply involved in this. I don't know if you got a sense of how, whether any of this is digitized and how that might help in the future. Smridhi, hello?
Yeah, I think that the sense we got, although this is a great question, and I don't think we explored it as much as maybe we would have if we thought about it before, but our sense was that record keeping in general is really horrendous when it comes to the Indian judiciary as a whole, and especially these foreigners' tribunals. Nothing is made electronic. To give you a specific example, there is actually an intention to keep information out from the public domain. So the most obvious example of it that people regularly cited in our interviews was the fact that the criteria for evaluating the performance of an FT member is never made known to the public. It's not available in public record, either in print or online. And foreigners' tribunals basically do not provide information regarding the kind of cases that come to them, the exact specifics of the cases. So I don't think the problem lies in lack of digitization. Rather, it lies in an intention to keep the information away from the public.
Okay, thank you very much. And as we're bumping up against time here, we have one last question, and that is the Citizenship Amendment Act an indication that Modi will take more actions in the future to marginalize the Muslim population in India? And are there fears that this step and future steps will erode India's democracy?
Well, many people say that. You know, it's hard to predict what a government will do. Many people say that this was definitely, it's a bold measure, but as I said before, it's not inconsistent with prior refugee policy. I think people have made it to be worse than it is because of the context of the Modi administration, knowing that it's Hindu nationalists, knowing that they have not tolerated dissent and not have been impinging on minority rights. But the policy of this disparate treatment, and even this exact policy of giving priority to certain religious groups from these three countries has been part of Indian policy since 2015. So I think that the whole protests were because of the fear that this is just the beginning, or this is the middle of a process of continuing to marginalize religious minorities as well as other minorities. We saw from this process in Assam that it disparately impacts women, it disparately impacts transgender people, it disparately impacts children who have a harder time showing up with the paperwork and documents that the process demands. In a way, it's, death by paperwork is sometimes how I call it. So clearly, I think the threat is there, but I think given the nationwide protests, there was some reaction with the beach. I think that is a kind of a wide awakening in a way to the government that, look, there's only so much that India will tolerate, Indian citizens will tolerate. And so hopefully that will limit somewhat of future activity. But, with the 21-day lockdown, this is an enormous act only that a very strong government can pull off. This is almost like demonetization, where overnight he said, okay, now your 100 and 500 rupee notes that you're holding is no longer valid, without telling everyone. So this, it would be interesting to see how the lockdown and the new kind of power that has been, all of our governments have ceded to themselves, take shape in the post-coronavirus world.
All right, thank you. Professor Kalantry, Smridhi, Prachee, thank you so much for taking the time today, and thank you for your work too. I think, Smridhi and Prachee in particular, and I know that there is another student who joined you as well who couldn't be on the call, but you all have, I think that this is tremendous work, and it goes to show just how important it is to be on the ground and talk to people and hear what is going on. So thank you all for your work and for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting us.
Very welcome. And just as a reminder to everyone who's listening, as we adapt to this post-COVID-19 world, Network 2020 is doing a lot of conference calls. So our next one is on Thursday, and we have Arthur Kerber, who will be talking about the economic situation in China, and that is, I believe it's Thursday at 12. All of the calls are on our website. We keep adding them, and we do encourage you to invite, friends and colleagues who might be interested to join. And thank you all, and have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. Take care.
Have a wonderful day.
Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.